Order.
Item 1, resumption of debate on the budget statement, first allotted day.
Professor Hoon Hian Teck.
Mr. Speaker, sir, giving his budget statement the title, Charting Our New Way Forward Together, the Minister for Finance devoted much space in his budget speech to talk about the need for revenue to bring all the plans that he had laid out to fruition. That prompts the question, why raise taxes? This is a fundamental question in political economy. I think that we can offer three answers. First, we raise taxes to create the fiscal capacity to support a well-functioning society. Second, we raise taxes to achieve economic inclusion. Third, and particularly relevant in the Singapore context, we raise taxes to pay for recurrent spending so that we can prioritize the use of our national reserves to manage external shocks as we remain integrated with the global economy. First, building fiscal capacity. We can take a cross-country perspective and an intertemporal perspective. When a country's income per capita is low, the need to raise taxes is great so that the country has the resources to provide public goods like national defense, law and order, as well as relief for the poor. Yet, the viable tax base is small because the tax administration and enforcement ability is low at this stage of economic development. Historically, countries that are starting on the path of development turn to trade taxes in order to generate government revenue to pay for the expenditure. Trade taxes have tended to make up a larger share of total tax revenue at the early stages of economic development because it is relatively easy to keep track of the flow of goods at major shipping ports. These countries then shifted to greater reliance on direct taxation of income, which happened late in the 19th century, and broad-based consumption taxes, which happened from the middle of the 20th century. In Singapore, in 1965, when we became a newly independent country, customs and excise duties make up actually more than 50% of the share of total tax revenue. It steadily declined through the decades, and now make up less than 5% of tax revenue. Consumption taxes were introduced in Singapore only later in 1994. There is a sense in which the way that tax revenues are spent, notably on education, which has been a priority in the very early budgets, is a form of investment in building fiscal capacity. Spending on public schooling generates a virtuous cycle. As a human capital base is expanded, the size of the economic pie grows, so the tax base correspondingly increases. At this stage of our development, boosting innovative activities will play a bigger role in growing the economy, and thus the tax base in the post-COVID-19 world. The support given in Budget 2022 to further strengthen the collaboration in engaging in R&D projects between SMEs and our polytechnics and ITE ultimately expands our fiscal capacity. The initiative dubbed Singapore Global Enterprises provide fiscal support for our large local enterprises, LLEs, to break into overseas markets. As our LLEs expand into overseas markets and become bigger and more productive, they become more profitable and can afford to pay their workers more. It is a statistical, empirical fact that larger firms doing the same business tend to pay their workers more because they are more productive, and they tend to break into overseas markets. The tax base is accordingly expanded. However, there are also factors acting to contract our fiscal capacity. One is the demographic transition and increased life expectancy. With the bigger share of the population becoming economically inactive, the tax base becomes relatively smaller. I think that's a fact well recognized by many. Another factor that can reduce our fiscal capacity comes from the harm that is caused by climate change, a point that many members have alluded to. The proposed schedule of increases in carbon taxes introduced in Budget 2022 can be justified on the basis of helping businesses internalize the negative externalities caused by emission of greenhouse gases. Unlike a tax on labor income, as an example, which reduces economic efficiency because people respond by working fewer hours when their take-home pay is reduced. A carbon tax, nevertheless, increases efficiency because it reduces activities that society wants to reduce. Roughly speaking, an efficient outcome is for the carbon tax on firms to be set equal to the amount of external damage caused by the greenhouse gas emission. Another point is that a carbon tax also has the effect of giving incentives for upstream firms to develop green technology by discouraging downstream firms from using devices that embody environmentally unfriendly technology. Second, achieving economic inclusion. There is a classic trade-off between equity and efficiency when we use fiscal tools to achieve economic inclusion. Budget 2022 raises the marginal tax rate of the highest income earners, among other measures. While this narrows the income gap, there are microeconomic distortions caused by such tax increases, also called excess burden. It's a standard concept in public finance. The idea is that the quantity of an economic activity, such as labor supply, decreases when there is an increase in the income tax rate. In designing an optimal tax policy, the government has to take into account the fact that raising the tax rate has consequences for the tax base. Because if the income tax on income earners goes up, as an example, they work less, the tax base shrinks. So there is an efficiency loss. Nevertheless, despite the loss in efficiency, every society has still got to choose a point on the equity efficiency frontier, sacrificing some efficiency in order to attain a desired level of equity. Since the excess burden of a given tax rate increase rises more than proportionately, it is optimal to broaden the tax mix from this perspective, such as relying also on other tax instruments like raising consumption taxes and wealth taxes to pay for higher social spending. That argument calls for some diversification of tax instruments rather than a dependence on a very narrow particular tax. Budget 2022 seeks to avoid the regressive nature of the increase in consumption tax rate via the assurance package and by boosting the permanent GST vouchers. Since the beginning of the 20th century, and especially in the post-war period, in international cross-sections of countries, there has not been a clear negative relationship between the level of growth of tax-based social spending and GDP per capita. In other words, looking historically, particularly over the last century and across countries as a whole, broadly, the message is that the social cost of financing higher social spending through taxes does not appear to be especially high. Although, obviously, to achieve a certain point on the equity efficiency frontier, there is an efficiency loss, and society has to make its own calculation. Being engaged in work confers non-pecuniary, that is non-monetary benefits that go beyond receiving wages. From that perspective, the use of wage subsidies or wage credits extended to firms as in the progressive wage credit scheme announced in Budget 2022 to co-fund wage increases for certain lower wage workers, as well as the wage income supplements extended to workers through the Workfare Income Supplement WIS scheme, boost workers' take-home wage earnings without discouraging work. For me, it is significant that the WIS scheme will be extended to younger workers aged 30 to 34. Another point, investment in children from low-income families facilitates upward social mobility, and in that way boosts future fiscal capacity when these children, having received help to overcome the initial disadvantages, take up good careers and pay taxes when they become adults. Health spending as a share of total government expenditure is expected to rise with the demographic transition. Enabling our senior citizens to live healthily adds to the country's stock of social capital. It can be argued that even the younger segment of the current population may want the government to raise taxes to pay for health spending going to the elderly so as to lighten the financial burden of providing care to their parents. Third, and my final point, prioritizing use of national reserves to manage external shocks, particularly negative external shocks. Remaining integrated with the global economy presents Singapore with the opportunity to grow. I think it's undeniable that much of our catch-up from third world to first world was facilitated by international integration. But the earlier stage was very much about technology transfer. In the next stage, we will have to generate innovative activities, but in order to have a steady contribution to growth of the economy, our firms will have to be integrated into the global economy, selling not only domestically, but into the region and into the world as well. But remaining integrated with the global economy will come at a cost of sometimes sharp recessionary shocks. Responding to the global financial crisis from 2007 to 2009, and currently, in the last 2 years, the COVID-19 health shock. If we were to respond to these negative shocks by raising taxes to finance the national efforts to save jobs, that would be tantamount to incurring huge excess burdens on taxpayers. Recall that the excess burden rises more than proportionately by every unit increase in the tax rate. So being able to draw down our reserves to fund these schemes to save jobs, and especially in coping the global financial crisis, for the government to share some financial risk, allows us to smoothen the tax rate across business cycles. When the economy has recovered, it would be necessary to tax finance recurrent spending in order to keep our reserves for rainy days. The fact that our social security system, the Central Provident Fund, is a fully funded rather than a pay-as-you-go old age retirement scheme contributes to our national savings and thus adds to the stock of reserves. Even as the share of the aging population increases and life expectancy rises, I note that Budget 2022, in increasing the employer and employee CPF contribution rates of workers aged 55 to 70, will boost their retirement adequacy. Now, one context in which there is justification for the government to borrow rather than tax finance is raising taxes for infrastructure investment, which serves to mitigate the adverse effects of climate change, such as seawalls and dikes. Intergenerational distributive justice provides a basis for the significant Infrastructure Government Loan Act passed in Parliament last year. Mr. Speaker, sir, we each function as an individual within a society. The emphasis in the last statement is on the words individual and society. Much of real life is not well represented by the story of Robinson Crusoe, a story that we tend to use in teaching international trade in the classroom. He was, of course, a castaway who lived alone on a deserted island for many years. As entertaining as the novel by Daniel Defoe is, Budget 2022 is built on the premise that we can build a dynamic economy, although more mature now. We've transited from third world to first world. The challenges are bigger. And we need now to generate our own indigenous innovation to propel the productivity growth that we continue to need in order to grow the economy, in order that our citizens will flourish. But such an economy where social collaboration results in creating a surplus. So the economy is not an individual, like living an island trading with another, although that helps. But within the society, we each have different capacities, we each have different strengths. And a society enables that social collaboration so that we create this social surplus. And that social surplus can be utilized through the fiscal system to leave everyone better off than if we had each function in isolation. I stand in support of the budget.